Welcome to the 6th Annual Mother Tongue Film Festival. Thank you for joining us. Live real-time captioning and American Sign Language interpretation are available during today's live program. To view the simulcast that includes these services, please use the link provided in the comment sections. If you're viewing this program after the live broadcast, please note that it will also be made available on our website with closed captioning. My name is Joshua Bell, and I'm Curator of Globalization at the National Museum of Natural History and co-director of the Mother Tongue Film Festival. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge with respect the Piscataway people on whose traditional territory the Smithsonian, indeed my own home, stand, and whose relationship with the land west of the Chesapeake Bay continues today. Founded in 2016, the Mother Tongue Film Festival open annually on the United Nations International Mother's Language Day, which is February 21st. The festival is an effort of recovering voices, a Smithsonian initiative involving the National Museum of Natural History, the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, the National Museum of American Indian, and the Asia Pacific American Center. We are grateful to our Smithsonian and non-Smithsonian partners for their support, and extend our thanks to our sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find on our website for this and our other events. Particularly, I want to give a shout out to the Documentary Educational Resources, or DER, who's helping to co-sponsor this event. Today, I welcome you to the Archival Roundtable, Anthropologists as Storytellers. This program is presented as part of the 2021 Mother Tongue Film Festival, whose theme is the healing power of storytelling. This year, the festival takes place entirely online and runs through the end of May. As always, the festival highlights and celebrates the confluence of cinematic and mother languages. Today, we invite you to participate in a conversation about the important body of work by anthropologists and filmmakers Lina Fruzzetti and Ákos Östör, whose films have been recently deposited in the Human Studies Film Archive, which is part of the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archive. Doing so, today we are going to reflect on their work's trajectory and craft, but also reflect on how anthropologists more widely tell the stories that they do. We'll be taking your comments and questions in the live chat below, so please participate. If you are new to the festival, I encourage you to check out mothertongue.si.edu to learn about the featured films and upcoming events. Your feedback is also welcome on the festival's social media channels. Now I'd like to welcome our guests, filmmakers and professor of anthropology, Lina Fruzzetti and Ákos Östör, who are joining us from Providence, Rhode Island. Alice Apley, executive director of Documentary Educational Resources, who's joining us from Boston, Massachusetts. And Pam Wintle, senior film archivist at the Human Studies Film Archive, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Joshua. On behalf of DER, I'm delighted to be partnering with the Smithsonian on the screenings of Ákos and Lina's work and today's discussion. DER has upwards of 25 films and collections that are a part of the Human Studies Film Collection and that we distribute. Ákos and Lina's works are one of the gems in that collection, and it's a real treat to take the time today to, albeit virtually, to talk with the filmmakers and with Pam about this important body of work. So I want to just jump right in, Lina and Ákos, and start off with kind of a big question about, as anthropologists and filmmakers, can you talk briefly about how you bring these two disciplines together in your work?
I think I'll start off with a brief response there, and then cue Lina in to follow.
Okay.
Just a preamble, because it needs a little preamble, that before we came together as filmmakers, I've already done a bunch of work with my then colleagues and friends and then university in Bengal, a trilogy of films to do with ritual that were very self-consciously based on previous research and publications. Now, at this point, I think we can say that what is remarkable is that with a strong research background, fieldwork prior to filming, afforded us to be able to allow for the unexpected, to deal with circumstance, and evolve kind of naturally, unfolding from film to film. Now, this previous work then shifted gradually towards just picking particular films for and do the research for them rather than start with anthropology and follow. So the first few films in Bengal, in effect, gave a basis for what we did later. But the pivotal film that we came to work on together was Seed and Earth. And this one was the product of various circumstances and unexpected developments in the field. But again, the background of fieldwork allowed us to then, with my colleague Alfred Guzzetti, to adapt and deal with what was the reality in front of us. And due to another coincidence or unexpected development, we had to bring in Lina and Ned Johnson to complete the film in its second half. After this kind of break in filmmaking, we did a complete about turn and went to Africa to make films and do fieldwork and anthropology, and as a contrast to India, which served us well in subsequent work as well. So in this period we went to make a film about the fish market in Dar es Salaam and a charismatic person in Zanzibar. Again, it's something that we can talk about later. But after this, we switched back to India and completed two films about the singers and scroll painters in the Patua community, which is going on rapid social changes and so forth. Now, there, as always, we start with an idea, and then the idea develops and becomes a book or a film and so forth. And in this case, we dealt with performers who were a delight to work with because they were literally presenting themselves as storytellers to other storytellers and to an audience that they were extraordinarily well used to. So they would have no ums and oohs and whatnot in speech. It was absolutely polished. After this came another break, and it brought us to the current, our latest film. And even in this, though very personal, the extraordinary thing was how much our work in publications and films and anthropology and film coincided and brought together what I like to call the ethnographer's knowledge with the filmmaker's art and craft, and then developed these to the betterment of both, if one can say that. So now, with that, I think it's Lina's turn to give her tale with this collaboration.
And before you jump in, Ákos, there's some kind of squeaking coming from your headphones. If you can just unplug your headphones and microphone and speak directly to the computer, we think it would be better. Okay?
Just use the computers?
Just unplug unplug the headphones.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I don't hear Lina right now. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I don't hear you.
Lina, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So I wasn't really a filmmaker till the late 80s. I was asked by Ákos and Alfred Guzzetti to come and complete a film that they had started. And what they realized was missing was the women's component. And I have done numerous projects on issues of gender in Bengal, and published on that subject. So for me to jump in without even thinking about what it is I'm doing, in the back of my head, I had the idea of what the ethnography of women is all about. And so I had a routine of how they function on a day-to-day. So if I took a day in the life of a woman, I decided to follow that with Nate Johnson, who accompanied me as the one who was sort of doing the filming. And together we were very successful because I would guide him and point him to a particular event. And sometimes we had this discussion of whether it is visually interesting or not. I said, that doesn't matter. What's interesting is the conversation that's taking place. But he didn't know the language. And so we worked that way. So having had a sense of what the women's world was all about, I could do it as if it was my second nature. It was very easy to really join somebody who was the filmmaker and guide or be the person to point at what is important. So for that film, which later on became Seed and Earth, which really combines my work on women and Ákos's work on men, it's about the complementarity of those two that made up the film successful. And it's really one of the most, beautifully visualized film, easier to see and understand than perhaps to read the book, because the book tends to be a bit dense unless you really are into the density of the words and text and so forth.
Yeah.
But to contrast that film with the last film that I also worked with Ákos, and in between we have a number of other films. The last film, I did not do research on the last film. The last film is the film about In My Mother's House, and it is basically about a woman, about my mother. And so even though I didn't do the research, I lived that life. And so it's basically an extension of a woman, and I seen as her daughter, what do I see in the lives of this one woman? And so the interesting thing is, I was 5 years old, or soon after 5, that I was in boarding school. So I didn't really know much about my mother. And from high school, I went straight to Chicago to study. But what I came to know about her, what people were telling me about, you have an amazing mother and so forth. The stories that I started to collect about her really overwhelmed me sometimes. And I said, there's so little I know about her. So we decided to sit together and film this woman's life for the grandchildren, as to present her grandchildren or grandchildren. And from then on, an event happened while we were finished this video of my mother, that later on we decided it's too important, it is too powerful to just leave it for us. This has to be shared. The more we screen this film, the more people tell us, or tell me directly, or her son-in-law, which is the filmmaker, Ákos, that this film is really not yours, it's ours. This woman is not just your mother, it's our mother. So here is the story of a woman that gets appropriated across generations of people that come to see it, but also people, whether they are in the United States, in Europe, or in India. And multiple stories they tell us how the film affected them in a way that we had no idea that that's what was happening to the film. So my entrance into the film isn't in the technicalities of the filmmaking itself, but in the ethnography of it, in the stories that it tells. And every film, I think, has a powerful story that it can tell.
So it's interesting because, in going from Seed and Earth, which is along with Fishes of Dart, it's sort of these traditional approaches to ethnographic filmmaking. They're community studies in a way. From watching Seed and Earth, you sort of get a sense that there's that this is sort of a very, very beautifully and artfully put together, but a catalog of activities that are done by men and women, which feels very planned. When I was watching it, it felt very, thought out. Whereas in watching In My Mother's House, the last film, to me, it struck me that it seemed like the film really unfolds in front of the camera. The story unfolds, you're discovering. And I wondered if you could talk about storytelling through film as anthropologists and these different choices and approaches.
You want to go, Ákos?
Yeah.
So you're right. You're absolutely right. And that in My Mother's House, it unfolded, and the story itself unfolded, and it's done exactly at the time that it was filmed as it was happening. And unlike Seed and Earth, it might appear that it is planned, but it wasn't. The part of the film that was done by Ákos and Alfred Guzzetti, and the part that was done with Ned and myself, in a way they fit together, but they weren't done we followed a routine of what people do on a daily basis. Right. Men get up and go to the farms. Women start in the kitchen. So there is like this private and public domain. The only time you see women in the public is when they go to bathe. So there wasn't anything planned or added to the film. It might appear like that, but it's like you get up, you dress up, you go to the office and come back, something like that.
Yeah, but it's planned in the sense that you knew there were certain kinds of activities you were looking for. Whereas in My Mother's House, my sense is you didn't know where you were going to travel next in following this journey of your family.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is there something, what's lost or gained in those two very different
approaches?
Yeah, and approaches. Ákos, you're muted. Yes.
Okay. You can hear me?
Yeah, there is an echo.
There's
an echo. Maybe I have to take over, Lina, while I plug myself back in.
Ákos, you know what okay, now talk.
Okay, is this better?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Give it a try.
Yes.
Talk. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, just to catch up. Yes, indeed, because though they weren't necessarily conscious choices and decisions whether we do this, we never made a decision about whether we're doing film or anthropology. It was, again, because of this ethnographic, this critical knowledge, this density that we had in the background allowed us to respond. For example, in Seed and Earth, we just called it the rice film when we worked on it. Wanted to make a film about the rituals and sociology of rice making. Now, when we got to the field with Alfred, the monsoon failed and there was no no rice cultivation for a long time. So that's why that period in the film where it's all to do with a storm and rain and so forth. And it was later when they picked up that we saw it was actually in the editing that what you say comes through, that it was a kind of a counterpoint because it was naturally happening, but then we started with the outside of the village, came inside, we did the men's activities, we did the women's activities, play with the children. So this was over a 3 or 4 months period of filming by 4 filmmakers in sequence. So it was a very happy coming together of all of our crafts. And the other thing is that both Ned and Alfred were very close to the kind of approach we were taking. So they were I would call them ethnographic filmmakers without being anthropologists. So it came. And the Mother's House, the interesting part came when we decided to open it up and create a context for it. And then we added the colonialism, the Italians, the situation in Italy, the wider interviews with family members in Eritrea. These were all brought together both to discover the family and created for a bigger, wider story. And in between came the others that all had these both a response to the circumstance and reliance on our ethnographic approach, using the film techniques that seemed most serendipitous. Yeah.
But to add to what Ákos is saying is that unlike the other films and the other 5 films, the last one, of course, has its own difficulties and challenges. And it took 8 years to finish because it has to deal with multiplicity of languages. But also the personal aspect of the film was hard. For a long time, we just couldn't sit and look at the footage, especially after she passed away. And so I think to do that kind of film, it's not just a challenge, but it's inordinate difficulties of how you can separate yourself. There were times when I couldn't talk about the film at all.
It was very hard for Lina, especially the funeral, which again it was a trade-off between film and the storytelling, because many of our friends said that you have to start the film with the funeral. That's the strong, just as strong as the interview with Mama Lucia herself. But we felt that we'd rather lose something on that structural part and preserve what you rightly pointed out as this unfolding. So it couldn't come before everything else. Such are the compromises, I guess.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the middle films, Singing Pictures and Songs of a Sorrowful Man. And now you've moved, you moved continents later. But with Singing Pictures and Songs of a Sorrowful Man, I was thinking about the theme of this festival is about storytelling. And these are films about storytellers. Traditional storytellers, but in Singing Pictures, it focuses on women, and it talks about how women have not traditionally been in this position. And then the Patuas in the second film, in Songs of a Sorrowful Man, are from a minority group that are in this unique position that they can tell the stories of the Hindu stories and the Muslim stories. And I thought that was, interesting because it becomes so much about identity, but also about the role of storytellers sort of as marginal. And I wondered about you as filmmakers, as storytellers, how you thought about approaching telling the stories of these storytellers and what kind of stories would make sense.
It's a very good question, because when we went to set up to do this film, Singing Picture, it was a day after 9/11. And immediately we had to decide, should we continue with this film or should we just drop it, go back and come back another day? One of the members of the community said, don't do that, because if you do that, the Hindu majority that surrounds the village, the hamlet, will say, okay, even the Americans don't want you. Even the Americans have an issue with you because you are Muslims. So they said, do the film and we make sure nothing will ever happen to you. And they sort of promised to be our security guard. We started the film, but when we started the film, we had a collaborator, Aditi Shorkar, who wanted us to do, or to help do this film also, but about the man, particularly one man. And when we began to do the film with him, he was like a cardboard. He couldn't move. He was just fixated on watching this screen. And we just said, this is not a film. And so we started to walk around this Hamlet. And the more interesting section of the Hamlet were the women when they were painting outside their homes while cooking and taking care of the kids. I said, this is fantastic. This is a repetition of, some of the works we've done already. And so we started to film them, and the more we filmed them, the more we became really attracted to the stories that they are doing and painting on these scrolls. So the stories are about domestic violence, child abuse, the child girl, education of females, early marriages, everything that anybody who is socially conscious and aware would sort of say, this is fantastic. This is what I want to hear stories about. But also about gods and goddesses, Hindu gods, and these are Muslims, and they do gods and goddesses, and about their own Muslim saints, and they call them peers. So the more we got into the world of these women painters, it became very clear that their work, their visual represent, the topics they choose are something so significant that it's not just for the Hamlet, it's not just for India, but it goes beyond. And we brought them to Brown for three weeks, and they went to Wesleyan for 3 weeks. They became so popular that the popularity itself later on will cause them some problem. They became well known. They've traveled all over the world. They were in Australia, Europe, and so what I asked myself, what did we do something right in exposing them publicly in the way that we have done, trying to help them, trying to sell their art, to tell their story? What were the causes of some of these? And that's something we really have to think about. There were some tremendous changes that took on in the village when they returned and sort of tried to live a normal life. There was no normal life anymore. It had changed, some for the good and some maybe not so. A few women.
But by then, sorry, just to continue, but before then, though, they were already well known in India because the government has these ways of promoting traditional arts and crafts, and they performed at various festivals in all the major cities, capitals of the states in India. So that Dolina is right that this particular thing is that they started selling their scrolls in America for much higher prices, and they came back and did renovations to their houses, and so that created, as Lina says, this was the imbalance, the unintended consequence, and but it also empowered them much more. All of them were much more outspoken and confident, easy with audiences. And in terms of the stories, two films, the two halves, the two films in that community, there are some amazing things in the background that it's a little bit reminiscent of all the other films that we started out with something and turned into something else.
Yeah. So did you set out to make the films about fatwas from the second film? How did it change?
Yes.
Did you set out to make the same?
Well, it changed exactly as we had them already in the previous field work. There were fatwas scattered all over Bengal, but this was a concentration, and these were Muslims. In other places, they were Hindus. So this in between situation of theirs goes back to the deeper past of the itinerant singers, and scrolls were not sold. They were these torn classic examples of scrolls in museums now, that they would take around a performer, and they would be given mostly something in means, rice, vegetables, rather than cash, and they would bring this home. Now, when the women came in, they eventually began to earn more money, even locally. That created some problems. The other interesting thing here is that it brings the question of politics into that. There was very strong radical left and right stuff going on that influenced our filmmaker, just as Lina mentioned in 2001. Subsequently, there were very violent local elections, and not so much Hindu-Muslim, but different political parties in Bengal. Now, what happened is that we again started doing a single film, but we realized that Dukhu Sham, the sorrowful man, Dukho Sham means the sorrowful dark one, which is an appellation to Krishna, the second major figure in Hindu theology. And he has a Muslim name too, and he was such a charismatic person that he could come in and cut right through tradition and all the rest of it, and say, women, you can earn things, stay at home, and you go. So you start. But there is an injunction against women in the Quran. He said, no, there isn't. This is something you can do. And because he was such an extraordinary figure, everyone went along with it. And so we decided that we really had to make this into separate films, because Dukhu Sham could perform himself, and the whole film is structured around. He led us through this. The way it's edited is, he said, we'll be talking about this and that, and the other one, it was as Lina mentioned, concentrating on the women's activities. So
were the two actually filmed at the same time, and then they were edited? Oh, that's interesting.
We were able to sift the women and from the men, basically. That's what it was. It made two films.
But so very different, the issues of social status and identity in each are really about these two different social groups.
They're very different.
As painters.
And so it is. It resonates a little bit with the form of Khalfan and Zanzibar in a way, don't you think?
Transition, yes.
Okay.
Well, that's a great question. That's a great transition, because I was wondering, how did that film come about? And of course, that is a totally different structure. When we can talk about how it came about, and then also how it was structured and edited, because it's a very different approach.
So that was a very interesting film, how it happened. We were in Harare, Zimbabwe, for the annual African Archaeological Conference. And on our way back we were going back to the US, but we decided to stop in Tanzania. We took this flight, and at the airport, there was a huge commotion, so loud. And of course, curious me, I went to find out what is going on. And it turned out that a man was in a wheelchair, and he is telling British Airways, if you sold me a ticket, you have to get me to the plane. You have to get me on the flight. You can't sell a ticket and not be able. But sir, we don't have the means. And so I started to enter into the conversation. I don't know who this guy is, but I started to get into the conversation. And I said, he's right. If you don't do that, I'm going to tell the rest of us to cancel our flight. You need to get him on that flight. And she says to me, are you related to him? I said, no, but it's just a human issue here. He's in a wheel. What do you expect him to do? And so finally, they found a way to get him on. The three or four men literally carried him, because there was no ramp. They carried him to the plane. and everything went fine. And at the air, when we got to Dar es Salaam, he asked to talk to us. And he said, come and visit me in Zanzibar. And you're filmmakers, anthropologists. Why not make a film for me? But just come and see my organization. It was the first African organization about the disabled. If you lived in Africa, you know, if somebody in your family is disabled, for whatever part of the body is disabled, they hide that person. But he's saying, I want disability to be out there in society. We are like everybody else. And so we went to see him, and we talked about doing this film with him, but he wanted more of a propaganda. I said, no, we'll do a film that you can still use it for whatever purposes. And and I think I'll let Ákos talk about the structure, how we structured the film. But I remember asking him, but who are the disabled? And he mentioned the blind, somebody who has a blind, deaf, a number of disabled. And then he looks at me and he said, and you as a woman are disabled as well. And I said, okay. But then, you know, in editing the film was interesting, and also why we couldn't show the film, which later on maybe we can talk about. But this is a different film in that Ákos, Ákos, you should pick up on how we structured this film.
Yeah, and I thought it was also very interesting because it is so much about this gentleman and disability, but it's also about the place, and the way they're integrated is very interesting. So I'd love to hear about that. Yeah,
well, that was, yes, that's true. The film then developed in your field. I was there a bit longer because I was at the University of Dar es Salaam for a year, and Lina couldn't come for the whole year. She had to be back in Providence for one semester. And during that month, I got interested in the fish market in Dar es Salaam, and also followed up with Khalfan in Bad for 6 months back and forth already. And the way the film turned out is that we didn't want to make it into a portrait. We wanted to make a parallel between the history or the story of Khalfan and the story of Zanzibar itself. And he was just ideal in again. It was very easy talking about himself and his life through having gone to all kinds of conferences in around the world. But so we filmed various places in Zanzibar that and activities that then we thought that would create a context for the film, especially the activities of the otherwise abled, as sometimes they call themselves, otherwise abled people, especially the soccer match, which was an absolute revelation. And then Alfred came up with the idea that we're doing so many fragments here. Why don't we fragment the film completely? And then we had this scrolling text and historical asides and narration, completely breaking with, I think, all traditions of ethnographic filmmaking, and still ending up with a film that is ethnographic, historical. After all anthropology, as Evans Pritchard used to say at the end of life, anthropology turns into history at some point.
Yeah,
in a few
years. I think
years.
it's interesting. We've talked now about the different films and storytelling structures. They are so different from the very structured, what you were just talking about, or the sort of very novel structure of the two parallel stories about a person and a place and the text, etc., versus singing pictures and all of the previous films, which were much more traditionally observational and stuff. And do you feel like there are things that are lost or gained in choosing one structure or storytelling technique over another?
Yeah, I think then I'll just start briefly and then hand over to Lina, because it's interesting our parallel approaches, but also different differences, and in all these developments, we didn't respond to consciously to changing practices in film or changing developments anthropology. We went from almost as a kind of a natural development and transition from one film to the other, according to what seemed to be the next from the work we've already performed there, and of course, we responded more to the demands of the film that we chose to work on, and then utilized again techniques that didn't seem to be again consciously modeled on anyone else's or any other films or any other convention, but it responded to the particular demands of the locality, the history, the background. Since we had so much experience by then, that we could confidently step in, and especially the approach that took people into our confidence. So our directors were primarily the people whose community welcomed us and we were guests in, and they often took the lead in this, and we expanded and so forth. Now, Lina has more to say on this.
No, I think you've done it actually. See, my sense to answer your question is when you talk about the structure of a film, we cannot do more or less than what is in front of us. We cannot really adapt or introduce what is already out there. So everything has to be structured in accordance to what we know about a community, a place, its own particularities, and that gets incorporated in how we, not how we see it, but how we visualize it, and how we it's true that the members of the community, the people that were represented in the film, become almost our guides to how we move from point A to point B.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that in all of these films, with the exception perhaps of the last one, In My Mother's House, all of these films were taken back to the community before the final sort of life of a film, before we decide this is it, let's take it to the labs and so on. That's the point that for me is the most crucial and most important. And taking a film like Singing Picture, and I tell the women, because I sometimes Ákos goes, sometimes I do. This one I went and I told them, look, there are 2 points here in the film that bothers me, and I live in America. I don't live in India, and I'm not a Muslim. So are you okay with it? One, they were both plus they were criticizing their religious leaders because they said they lied to us. There is nothing in Islam about contraception and so on. And the other one was that if I don't abide by Islamic rules, they will drag me like a dead dog into the grave. So those are the things I said, are you sure you want us? They said, we told you this because we want it out there. So these women were stronger than me, who was at that time worried about what will happen to them. And the same thing with Khalfan. We finished that film, but it was never shown in Tanzania while he was alive. Because he said, don't show it worldwide, but don't show it in Tanzania, because if there are 2 things that I've said in the film that are politically problematic, And I could easily be thrown in jail. And I said, he said, I'm in a wheelchair. I cannot be in jail. And so we promised, we kept his promise, and we told him that we won't show it. When he passed away, his widow called us the next day. And she said, Khalfan passed away. I want you to come and bring the film and show it. And I went with 50 copies of this film to give to their organization. And
we asked you to provide some.
gracefully provided the film. And when we were showing you, there were 4 or 5 religious Maulawis who said to me, you cannot, in Islam, we don't have a memorial service. I said, this is a celebration. We're celebrating this man for what he's done. And they said, well, we don't think we should show this film. His widow said to me, she was sitting in the front pew, she went, you sit next to me. And I did. And she said, don't worry, nothing will happen. There were 3 or 4 of them arguing that this should not happen. And we shot the film. In the end, one of them came and said, I want to thank you personally because the film was very respectful of the man and very respectful of our religion. So I think we, as anthropologists or filmmakers,
that they would be worried about that. It's interesting that they would be worried about that. Did they distrust what the film would be like?
They didn't know what the film was about. And here is the outsider from the United States. Mind you, anything to do with the US after 9/11 is problematic everywhere in the world, except, and so these were people who were really antagonistic, and just said, what are you going to show? And in the case of, if I might just add this last bit, in the case of Singing Picture, 2 or 3 women gave up the art of painting, and they're the good ones. And it's sad because they were their income was supporting the family, but they get pressured from outside forces. The more conservative religious groups who tell them, as Muslims and as women, you should not be in the open like that. You should give up this and stick to just religious learning and so on.
And was it being part of the film that we increased exposure? No, it was just that they didn't.
I see what you mean.
What happened there is, to add to what Lina said, that subsequent political and religious developments sharpened this conflict, both in Bengal and Zanzibar. So as a different kind of more conservative version of Islam came in, and it was well financed from the Middle East, both in India, and so for different people started appearing, different demands were. So then this Patwa community, then they had problems with the Hindu majorities, saying that you guys are not really Hindu. Then these conservative Muslims said, you're not Muslim. So if you want to do that, then grow your beards and stop the women from doing this. So many of the women didn't stop, and their husbands supported them. And these were just developments that they had to negotiate day to day, and we didn't instigate, and we just responded to the demands of the story.
Yeah. So I want to pull Pam into the conversation. Pam, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this body of work fits into the Human Studies Film Archive.
Well, I kind of feel like I'm the required PSA announcement at this point because I'm learning so much from both Lina and Ákos. So I really appreciate this dialogue that we're having. And I'm trying to think about it. I've been thinking about this and hope I'm coherent because I feel like I've got several thoughts all crashing together at the same time. But I'm thinking about you as anthropologists, as storytellers, which is what this is about, and thinking that you're clearly text-oriented as well. That, I mean, you've written a lot, and yet, you have this sense of the visual, that you know how to tell a story through this other medium, which to me is just really fascinating that you can embrace this, and of course, I think you realize that you can reach more people through this medium than you are through, as you say, Lina, the dry text or the very deep text of an ethnography. And so in looking at your story compared to other collections in the archives, I mean, we have films that other anthropologists have shot, but as part of their research, and they're not really telling stories. They might have used them in the classroom, or they may have referred back to them in writing their ethnographies. I mean, the stories aren't told yet, is the way I like to think about it. And then we also have filmmakers who have worked in close association with anthropologists, then the classic one being Tim Ash and Napoleon Chagnon. You know, and but your stories, you really come from this from a different place. And I think that, and the ability to be capturing your stories about these stories now will provide for the future this incredible contextualization of your work. And as Alice has pointed out, the very different styles that you've used for your subject matter, and letting your subjects really speak for who they are. And then I'd like to think that you have told your stories from this film, but once it comes into the archives and is made available, whether it be digitization or whatever the future, and I believe the future holds other formats for us, but that these records can go back to the communities and other stories can be told. And they can tell stories. And so I like to think that that there are multiple stories here that will eventually be told from this. Now, it's hard to think, Lina, about In My Mother's House, because that's such a personal film to you. But I think it tells its story because it is everybody's story. In one way or another, this is just, it's a very moving. In fact, I'm going to start crying when I start thinking about it, because it is just such a moving film about who we are, where we came from, our embrace of the unexpected and the unknown, and the way these relatives keep appearing. I mean, you end up in Spain, you know, which was like a total surprise, you know, but I just, I don't think I really have the words to express how special this collection is to the Human Studies Film Archives and to the Smithsonian and the Smithsonian's goal, which is, you know, it's about diversity, it's about cultures. I mean, there's one of the grand challenges is called valuing world cultures. Well, that's exactly what you've done, is you've valued and you've shared your stories about world cultures with the world. And I thank you.
You're welcome.
Well,
And then, excuse me, Ákos, go ahead.
no, I just wanted to thank you because really, I'm sure Lina will agree. We didn't think of this work in exactly the same way as you presented, and so this is something new for me and very reassuring that we did something right, and that it goes beyond bigger than ourselves, and
Yes.
and that was so well put, I think.
Yeah,
But
it was well put.
It's interesting to think about, you know, Pam's discussion about the life of the film in the archives, and thinking about there are scholars on the one hand and there's the community on the other. And I'm wondering if you have other kind of stories or surprises. And also I'm wondering, do you think about the legacy of a film when you're working on it? You know, and I think the story of, you know, what happened with the CalFam film is amazing, you know. And so I'm wondering if you have any other stories of the circulation of the others or the community reception.
We have, I mean, just, Pam, you made me cry a little. I just say one thing about the film, the last film that we did, it was shown in Italy. And I had this incredible fear of what the Italians would say, because they weren't, I mean, part of my family wasn't the kindest to my mother. And so I worried because I said, maybe they think I was criticizing them. Maybe I was, but I was presenting the facts as they happen. And in the Q&A, I just couldn't. It was so successful. They had the room for 200, but they had another 200 waiting to get in. They couldn't. And for the 3 more days that we stayed in the town of my father, Carrara, I had people come and hug me and say, "I'm so sorry about what my forefathers did. I want you to forgive me." So it was a total different kind of reaction. And they said, "We didn't know we had colonies in Eritrea or Libya or Somalia, and the history books don't tell us about that." And it is true. So in a way, this person who is half Italian with a Hungarian husband is teaching them about their history, that there is a good history and there is a not so good history that you need to also understand. But when you think about what's happening today in Italy with the immigrants and all the crisis and sufferings of some of these illegal or legal refugees, a film like that, I don't know if we were to show it today, how they would interpret it.
Mm-hmm.
This was shown a few years back, 2 or 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and we had a question from someone in the audience about, I think responding to the earlier story of the impact on the women storytellers and how they gave up doing that work. And the question was, now that you know some of the more negative effects of the films, would you take this into consideration for your next film? Would you warn your subjects? Is that something that you think about?
Yeah, it's a good question, another good one. But I think right now we're working on a number of fronts that may be of interest. Namely, we did some exhibitions, which were another whole other challenge based on the films in Lisbon and Helsinki and Geneva and so forth. And now we still have a kind of a compilation film coming from previous material that kind of chronicles this almost 40-year span that we spent in Bishnupur, that town in West Bengal, called Bishnupur Lives, and also some new venture that is an ethnographic electronic website combined monograph. I'm not sure which one, close-ended or open-ended, like a website that places all the In My Mother's House specifically into an extraordinarily complex background. It has, being a digital publication, it has the opportunity to deal with the impact of fascism, for example, then communism, and the reason why Italy evolved in a particular way that affected this particular family and their spreading into the diaspora. Also, the events in Eritrea that, though the Italian colonialism had a great impact, obviously, but followed by a 30-year period of
Civil war,
of resistance and civil war against the Ethiopian regime, which still has goings on. If it just, most people don't pay attention to the Horn of Africa, but the developments there are so extraordinary, and this format, this digital format with these different layers, allows us to branch out into the world, within the same publication. So God willing, we'll keep doing this.
That's a project that's funded by the Carnegie Corporation, New York. It's very strong.
So that's interesting because it speaks to the relationship between films and other kinds of kind of text or online publications that can complement it. And also, I wonder, Tim Ash really was a proponent of you have to have ancillary materials in order to understand the film. And yet I think actually watching your films, they all stand on their own without that. But there is something, of course, that, you can add a lot. So like even going into working on a web publication, what do you think about as, what's the potential there? And what kinds of information can you convey in a film versus in the text versus, on a new digital platform?
Well, the beauty of film is that it brings the visual to sometimes to a dense interpretation of a topic. To call it monograph. The one that we are right now working on, it incorporates bits and pieces of the film itself in my mother's house, but also multiplicity of interviews that were never used for the film. But it also looks into a particular period in Italian history or Eritrea. Whatever was written about that period, it's also we incorporate it into this text. So you have historic material, interviews, you have photographs. Photographs tell a different story, not just films. Film is a moving sort of visual, but the photographs tell, whether it is film, pictures of the 1920s and 30s or the 70s. So, and then the songs, we bring in a lot of songs about a particular period in that reflects to the film. Growing up, and my mother would sing a song, and I would tell her, Mama, I've just heard that this is not a good song for you to sing about. And she would say, well, we just sang it when we were kids. We don't really pay attention to the words. So songs also be, we use them in someone. So this text, this monograph, digital monograph that we're working on, will incorporate levels and levels of different medium of how you sell an idea, and whether the idea. You are?
No, sorry. I just wanted to say that, adding on behalf of the other films, and also following up Pam's observations, that we're able to not just bring it back to the communities that we worked in, but to follow up the repercussions, the subsequent histories, and in a sense, we can once this is all going over to the Smithsonian, it will have these field notes and drafts and publications and videos, and also some evidence of the films that were not made, that, and then bringing in all these other things, the politics, the difficulty of securing grant applications, different than getting permissions. That's a whole other enormous headache, often taking a year before you can move anywhere. All of this one has to juggle while also having children and seeing them grow up and wanting to see the grandchildren grow up, and yet you're in the way of harm, as it were, throughout. It's I must say it's a wonderful life with all its contingencies.
So in the archive, I was coming into this conversation thinking about the films being deposited there, both, and I assume it's both the films and the outtakes. And,
Yes.
and do you have other stuff, and how do you kind of link them together or make them accessible? And can you talk a little bit about the diversity of materials?
Well, I mean, I forgot to mention that I see out of this collection there are several PhD dissertations yet to come. I mean, so, I mean, because this hasn't really been explored yet, because I think it's the difficulty of making, when film was film and videotape is videotape, it's, you know, it was only accessible on site basically. And you have to have, you can't use archival originals, so you really need to have access copies. And so the digital world has opened up a whole new way of accessing, and you're like, as soon as you start telling me about this website you're creating, I'm going, ooh, who's going to archive that? So to say that we're plunging into this new world is, I don't say this lightly, because we really are plunging into this new world, but it's also exciting because for the first time you can make these materials more easily accessible, which will encourage use. And so what that will be, I honestly don't know, because as we so rapidly moved from film to videotape to digital, you know, it's just going to continue to move rapidly. We don't know what the end point is yet. That's my feeling, at least. And all we can do is just try to do the best we can at the moment we're in to make this material accessible. So I'm very excited about the potential of the future of this material. And your website sounds terrific, and it's just terrifying to think about archiving it.
It's terrifying for us to construct it.
I can appreciate that. So there's another conversation to be had once it's out. You know?
Yeah, just quickly, the stability of film and paper far outweighs that of the digital platforms, because you know, we did a website that was up and running for several years at Wesleyan called Learning Objects, that was cycles of life in Bishnupur based upon our work, and another one called based on the scrolls, and that's both of them were compromised, and the technology, in 10 years, the technology disappeared and couldn't be replicated. So the scroll ones we rebuilt and is up at Wesleyan but the cycles of life is still being born. But it just shows you that some of the applications, some of the operating systems are changed in 10 years. So what you say about the future is such an unknown. Just hopefully there will be a way of preserving the previous chapters in this development.
Yes.
So we have another question from the chat, which I want to share. Do you think that ethnographic film can also act as a positive agent of change, broadening horizons and informing people of wider global trends that impact many different cultures and communities?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I personally think and know that ethnographic films, I wouldn't say all of them, because there are some that are just killers. I mean, they're so deadening. I mean, those are the earlier kind of anthropological documentaries, kind of film. But ethnographic film, I think, are amenable, and the reason they are made. I mean, all of these films that we sort of worked on, we didn't think that we are doing them to get across this is about change. I mean, the person has to see it and decide for himself or herself, wow, this film is still informing me about many things. For example, when we showed the film of Khalfan and Zanzibar at the Margaret Mead Festival in New York, I remember this so clearly, going to the film at 8 a.m. The place was jam-packed, and most of the people were in some form of either a wheelchair or similar kinds of support for the person to get in and sit and watch this film. And the questions they said were, we had no idea that people like us somewhere else had this kind of suffering. I don't know what that film then, what else they thought about. But I think I would say simply, yes, they do change how we think about other people, but also it changes the people themselves that were part of this film. We didn't, it's not like we went thinking, this is what's going to happen. You don't really know. And that's why an earlier question that came up, we do discuss these films before we start with them. We are doing this film. Are you ready for it? These are the implications. No, let's do it.
And then, the subsequent issue that comes up always, that we didn't set out to make a film that was an intervention or that was investigative reporting. There's a lot of films today that are just that. And some of these films have been recently criticized, for example, that they don't interfere enough, that they don't instigate. And our answer has always been that we try to be true to the truth and to the reality. So we didn't hide domestic violence, but it was brought in indirectly as people brought this out themselves, and that in a way the films were not made to change situations. They were made to somehow, like Hamlet, hold up a mirror to life, which mirrors are a good image here, but it's through our craft, and the responsibility is ours. So I always say that the films made in India, in Africa, and Italy, and so forth, are critical enough. It's not our role to expose, to create exposés. We're trying to show the context and literally the truth of both responding to what people want, people say, people do, as Lina said, putting it into an anthropological context to interpret it, through theory and whatnot. And then creating this, what eventually amounts to, I think, visual knowledge. It's because film and the moving images primarily moves people. So it brings in, like my Lina's ethnography on marriage may move individual people if they read it. But that's not they want to find out the meaning of marriage in Bull, or the meaning of ritual in my Play of the Gods book. But once you put film, you also deal with this visual, immediate impact that people respond to emotionally. And that is still unknown how that develops in this new form that we.
And thanks. And
I have another question here from the audience. Do you foresee new learning programs in digital anthropology storytelling, and what would they include?
I don't know.
We've done this. Remember, Lina, we did this kind of thing in those. It's a very good point, but we did that in these what they call the learning objects 10 years back or 15 years back at Wesleyan. Learning objects where you did people. Some of my colleagues have developed very interesting responses with these that were used in courses, and so definitely the one thing we haven't discussed is the way we use these films in designing courses. And I, for example, we kept notes on student papers, which were often more insightful than professional reviews, kept some of them with the consent of the student, of course.
What's in terms of feedback on the filmmaking or catching ethnographic questions or issues?
Yeah, I think so, because what there was something else that in the teaching you have this, as well as there was something that occurred to me just now that that is another fascinating development, that you know, when you create something, then you don't quite know what the effect of it will be. And this is what we're trying to catch with extensive notes at when festivals, or we get invitations to give a lecture and show a film, and the responses to these seemingly ephemeral moments are extraordinary when you put them down in writing, like in Australia, we've shown a bunch of films, and what people see there. The best example for this is in my mother's house, that a few years ago, after the film came out in 2017, we were in India, and were invited to like a dozen universities all over the country. And these things don't get beyond that moment. They don't appear in publications unless somebody puts a blog or something. But it was fascinating that in Calcutta, for example, in the American Center, we had this big audience that comes to most of the programs, the films and whatnot. And then in that university, Lina, in Delhi, in Mayatres, the university, there was for students, and these two audiences between Calcutta and Delhi was absolutely amazing, because the students would say, many of them, they were moved by the In My Mother's House, and they would say, we know nothing about that. Didn't even know there was a country called Eritrea, or
which makes me angry, of course.
Nothing about Italian history, but we had partition in India, so families divided. I mean, that was such an astonishing. I didn't think of that the audiences bring their own expectation and interpretation. So it goes beyond the teaching to almost like public knowledge. That
I'm wondering, do you think though that audiences vary, or have brought, vary more in their responses to a film than to a text? Do you think that they engage more with that kind of visual emotional content, and there's more interpretation on the audience's part?
I think so. I really believe that film, and thanks to the visual, it's you don't just see it, it draws you, it consumes you. The subject becomes, or you can just say, this is not for me, and leave it. But once you are engaged with it, it's really some films really overwhelms me. And in that sense, not all films are going to have the same story to whoever watches it. And not all films are informative in the way, to answer the earlier question, that whether it's going to change them or not, but at least the ability for them to have seen it and to have gotten something out of it was there. And you have to be ready for it. And I think some people were not ready to watch the film In My Mother's House. They just, and it grabs them at one point, and some will want to know more about it. So in in the way that film exhibits itself, and the story would be different from reading a book about, let's say, Italian colonialism. So there is a kind of density that's not in the films. But there is a kind of another force in the film that takes a different part of your brain and say, wake up, this is something for you to know. So I would say that people would be more interested to watch a film than, I hate to say that, than to read the book, because we want our books read, but it is what it is. It's how people think for themselves.
So Pam, as a film archivist, you must think about that and the value of the films for the future.
I don't have an answer. I mean, I wonder about that, because I tend to use the example of, for instance, because climate change is changing the islands in Oceania so dramatically, and there's going to be huge displacement, most likely. And are they going to engage or want to engage with the films that we have of their community? The young, I don't know. I don't know how the young are going to, the generations will, I would like to believe that they will find value, not just for recreating like songs of the sorrowful, I can't even say the word. Man, so there's that taking a lot of the imagery that we have for revitalization purposes, but I'd like to think that they will also find other ways to engage with it, whether it's mixing it with something contemporary or whatever, or mixing it with different cultures, so it's not, but it's there as an exploration of the world as it was, and hopefully it will inform the world as it is and what it will be. We don't really know. It's kind of out of our hands at some point, but I mean, I can only hope that people would engage with it for the good.
Yeah. Very interesting.
So we just have a few more questions, and so I wanted to, or a few more minutes. So I wanted to kind of ask a wrap-up question of, you've been both making films for quite a long period of time, and also Ákos, you in particular have written quite a bit about ethnographic filmmaking and the changing trends and stuff, and we've talked a lot about some of the technological changes as well as some of the ethical and political contingencies. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts in terms of filmmaking today? What do you see as the sort of promise or the challenges for ethnographic filmmakers today?
Well, to start off, and I'll hand over to Lina, to start off, we mentioned that we're not doing expose type films of social problems and social issues, but also we mentioned that there are people who are doing that, and we don't believe that we are the voices to express other people's sufferings. And I think what's happening today is that there is a greater equity coming in between storytelling and the less no exploitation that I can see in the future, and the current, the people who are making films are either making them, or at least set out to make them, for the benefit of their own communities. Now, sometimes that turns into its opposite, as it must, because it's an intervention. For example, recently in Italy, there is a young Italian Ghanaian filmmaker who made several films especially about the situation of people who came to Italy very young and no other, in young age, but they're not given a path to citizenship, and based on this bizarre Italian law of jus soli. And so they're in a limbo because, perhaps due to the instability of Italian governments, which have other reasons, they have never been successfully able to address that issue. At the same time, they did bring a lot of Eritrean refugee families at the time of the civil war that had Italian mixed parentage, and there is a huge Eritrean community in various cities that is very active, and so the films that they make, and I think this is true elsewhere, that there are filmmakers, for example, the indigenous filmmakers in Australia is a fabulous array of films, limited series that some of the great indigenous filmmakers made. Now, they don't like to be called Aboriginal filmmakers because that puts them in a box. But people like Ivan Sen and a whole host of others are developing new, and their filmmaking is in a way similar to ours. That they, for example, there's this wonderful film that is a musical, and it's through that it addresses issues of the history, exploitation, and whatnot, but with such balanced and gentle filmmaking that you wonder, with this dreadful history, how can somebody be so generous, to Australia, seeing what. Well, anyway, these are some of. There are sharper ones, of course, as well. But I see such a nice, such a promising future for making some sort of visual work, whatever direction it takes.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I think that's a fabulous place to close the conversation. I know there are many, many more stories to tell, but time is up. So I want to thank you, Lina and Ákos and Pam, and thank you for making the films and for looking after the films. And I'm going to hand it back to Joshua to wrap this up.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Joshua is muted.
You're muted.
Rookie mistake. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to reiterate, thank you, everyone, to our panelists for sharing their experiences, insight, Lina, Ákos, Pam, Alice. This has been a really wonderful conversation. So it's really been fun to listen, laugh, and cry with you all while off camera. And I also want to thank you, big shout out to the audience for participating, to all who's watched, listened, and commented. And thank you to our CART and ASL providers who helped bring us this event to you, as well as to all the people behind the scenes that you haven't seen who have been feeding us questions and doing the technical work, Sarah, Cecilia, and everyone else. You know who you are. And I just want to urge you all to follow the Recovering Voices page on Facebook to get notification about our future events, to find us also on YouTube, to visit our website, and come back for our next program, which is a Q&A, live Q&A with director Su Hong In, who's director of The Mountain. And that will be next Friday on March 26th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. So thank you all, and enjoy watching the rest of the Mother Tongue Film Festival. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.